So last fall, my husband made a greenhouse, and that has been causing us to have a lot of conversations this year about whether the Bible has anything to say about whether children that grow up in a greenhouse that is loving and kind turn out better than those who grow out unsheltered and exposed to all the elements around. Basically, children that are covered with protection and love and care and justice and righteousness, as we said before, do seem to turn out better. What does the Bible say about this? So we did build a greenhouse last fall, and there were several purposes for us wanting to have a greenhouse. And I'm going to try to list these out, and I want you to be thinking in the terms of your children and the benefits to children of having a loving and kind greenhouse. First of all, a greenhouse provides a longer growing season. That's one of the reasons that we homeschool too. We want to provide our children with a longer growing season. We want to be the ones gardening for the longest period possible. And there's nothing that says that children have to even be kicked out at 18 just because that's what our society does. There's nothing biblical necessarily about that. We can have a longer growing season. We can start that growing season earlier and we can end it later. We also want plant protection. As you can see, our garden behind us is full sun, and some of that full sun is a little bit harsh for the plants that we're trying to grow. And our children also grow up in a culture that is full sun, even more so than it used to be. Our culture is harsh, and we want to give our plants, our children, some protection from the harshness of the culture around us. We want to also provide an ideal growing environment. We can control just about everything about the environment, and we can make it ideal through hard work. It took a lot of work to make the greenhouse, and just because it's made doesn't mean it doesn't require hard work every day to maintain all of that ideal plant culture, that environment that's perfect for plants. But it also takes hard work to grow children in an ideal plant environment. Just because you homeschool does not make it the ideal plant environment. In fact, one of the things we learned this spring is that it heats up inside of that greenhouse a lot faster than we expected it to. And when we first planted our seeds and put them in the greenhouse, we did not pay attention to the temperature in there. It got super hot. In fact, it was over 120 degrees in there, which killed everything that we were working on, and we had to start over. So again, just calling ourselves a homeschool does not provide an ideal growing environment, but with hard work and knowledge, we can provide an ideal growing environment for our children. Also, a greenhouse is energy saving and can be lower stress. Energy saving in that all of our things are at hand, and we can control the amount of energy that is required to keep everything at the right environment, or the right temperature, the right moisture, everything, the right light. Everything, again, can be controlled, and that can save a lot of energy. Lower stress, I think that's true of a homeschool environment as well. It can be. It doesn't guarantee it. We have to put the work in and the knowledge so we can do it with wisdom. But when we do, it can be energy efficient and a lot lower in stress for both ourselves and our children, especially our children, though. Isn't that the point of it? Even if the gardener has to work hard, we want our children to grow up in a low stress environment. It can be cost efficient. It costs a lot of money to run a public school, a lot of taxpayer funds, and homeschooling is just a cost-efficient way of doing things. One of the reasons is because when we do things according to God's teaching methods, where we spend a lot of time discussing and talking to our children, that doesn't cost anything. To talk to our children costs nothing except for our time. So there is some cost there. And we'll talk a little bit more about cost later in this conference, but I just wanted to mention that no matter how we teach our children, there are ways to make it more cost efficient. And a greenhouse did that for our plants, and it definitely can for our children as well. Plants tend to grow faster and healthier because it's an ideal temperature. And that, again, requires work. That doesn't just happen. We have to make it happen. We have to be thoughtful and cognitive and wise and understanding. But our children do tend to grow faster and healthier in a greenhouse environment. We also can grow more plants. And now, that little greenhouse behind me does not hold a ton of plants. My daughter works at a greenhouse full-time, and that greenhouse is huge. I should have asked her how many square feet it is. but it's just massive. And they can grow so many plants, all of them healthy, because the gardeners are going around every day checking the plants and being really careful. They have humidifiers, they have fans, they have irrigation systems, they have all of this. They have heating systems. So no matter what, it's always at an ideal temperature. And they can grow more plants because of it. They can grow such a volume of plants. And the cool thing about even at home, our little greenhouse, is that we can extend our growing season. We can grow earlier and grow later in the fall and get more plants that way as well. And also we can beautify the neighborhood. Now our garden behind us is a work in progress. I wouldn't call it the most beautiful greenhouse in the neighborhood right now, but as year after year we continue to build and grow on it, it will make our property more beautiful, and our home and our neighborhood, our town, more beautiful. And children that are raised in a righteous and godly and just home tend to beautify the neighborhood, if you know what I mean. They're not thought of as, oh, those kids, but they're thought of as, wow, those kids. All right. Finally, a greenhouse, and this was a new one for me, but it can alleviate seasonal affective disorder, that feeling of sadness when you have not had enough sunshine. There's something about going out in the greenhouse and seeing how pleasant and happy it is out there. Now, I would like to take a look at several verses in the Bible that talk about how to make a greenhouse in our homes, okay? The first one is in Joshua chapter 1, verse 8, and it says, "This book of the Torah shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success." So let's just take that apart really quickly. This book of the Torah, the Torah is the first 5 books of Moses, and we can't change that to say something that it doesn't say. Those books of the Torah shall not depart from our mouth. So that means that if we want to have an ideal learning environment in our homeschooling greenhouse, we need to make sure that the book of the Torah does not depart from our mouth. We need to be speaking it to our children and to ourselves out loud in our homes throughout the day. We need to be discussing it, as the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 7, it says, "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." So you need to be constantly keeping his Torah in your mouth and having discussions with your children. That is a fantastic way to make a loving and ideal greenhouse environment for your children. It also says, though, beyond that, you shall meditate in it day and night. And to meditate there means to be playing it over in our minds, to be mulling it over, to be chewing the cud, so to speak, swallowing it and bringing it back up again. We need to be meditating on the Torah all day and all night. See, that's a greenhouse environment. That's controlling everything, making everything that happens in our home be in alignment with the Torah. That's definitely not throwing it out into the heat of the garden, but that is keeping it in a Torah environment as constantly as possible. It says that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. So you also need to enforce that nothing comes into your greenhouse that would violate the Torah. Nothing is allowed to speak into your children that would violate the Torah. So one of the biggest jobs of a gardener who wants to keep a loving and ideal greenhouse environment is to guard. Just like Adam was placed in the garden to guard it and to tend it, we have to guard that everything that happens in our greenhouse is in accordance with the Torah. So this implies that you have to be reading the Torah often, meditating on it, talking about it, and enforcing it in your home. This is super important. Now next, let's go to Colossians 3, verses 18 and 19. We're going to talk about who is in charge of keeping this garden in a good working order, in this greenhouse, okay? It says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the master. Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them." So if we want to have a good environment in our greenhouse, we need to have an order, a ranking of who's in charge. Husbands are in charge. Wives are to submit to them just as they would submit to Yehovah. And as we do that, we are keeping our children, we are helping them understand the way Yehovah's garden works, that there is order, that there are people in charge and those under them do as they're told. It goes on to say, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to Yehovah, to the master. And fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Now, I am assuming that those listening to this conference, the majority of them are the wives. And so wives, your job is to submit to your husband, to line up your desires and wishes with what he wants to grow in the garden and in the greenhouse. You wouldn't go into the greenhouse and uproot everything that your husband had planted. You'd work together as a team. And that's really what this means, that wives, your job is to come along as a suitable helper to encourage and grow whatever your husband's desire was to grow in your household. And so that is your job, is to submit to him and to teach your children also to obey both of you in everything. That's a tall order, and something that if you want your homeschooling greenhouse to succeed, but you do not have a submissive marriage where you are listening and coming in line under your husband, or your children are not obedient to you, your greenhouse is simply not going to work. It's not a healthy greenhouse. It's a defective, falling apart greenhouse. Now, it also says that husbands are to love their wives and not be bitter against them. But if you're the wife, you can try to do everything in your power to encourage that love, but this is not speaking to you. And it says, fathers, don't provoke your children. So again, I'm not talking to the fathers, but it doesn't mean there aren't many, many, many instructions in the Word of God to those guys. I'm just talking to the ladies today, if that makes sense. Now, let's go back a page, and let's talk about what the ideal temperature inside the greenhouse is supposed to be. Is it supposed to be a temperature of oppression, where the men rule with an iron fist and the woman does whatever he says and they have no voice to speak? Well, there is a voice that a woman is supposed to speak in her home, and let's just go back to it. It says, verse 12, therefore, as the elect are chosen of God, holy, which means set apart for special purpose, and very, very loved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another if anyone has a complaint against another. Even as the Messiah forgave you, so you also must do. So you can definitely see the kind of love and humility and patience that is supposed to be in the right kind of greenhouse. This is how you have a loving greenhouse. You say, I'm going to forgive. That person did something and it kind of bugged me a little. And you're going to say, well, you know what? I'm going to forgive them because I do things too. And the Messiah had to forgive me, but I'm going to forgive my husband. I'm going to forgive my children. I'm going to bear with them. I'm not going to be a know-it-all. I'm going to be humble and say, maybe I could learn from you. These are the kinds of gentle, peaceful ways that a greenhouse thrives, okay? And then it continues, above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, in your greenhouse, to whom also you were called in one body. You are one body, one home. Go together in peace and love, forgiving, humility. And it says, continuing, be thankful. And then it says, let the word of Messiah dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to Yehovah, to the Master. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do all in the name of the Master Yeshua, giving thanks to God the Father through him. My goodness, if there was anything you could do to make your greenhouse a loving and peaceful atmosphere this school year, you could take those verses 12 through 17 of Colossians, and you could write them out. You could probably, in my Bible, turn the page and keep going with the wives submitting, and the husbands and the children and the fathers and the bondservants who have employers, and they have to work for them. And everything that you do, serving. It says, whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Master and not unto men, knowing that from the Master, from Yehovah, you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Master, the Messiah. So it just goes on and on. So Colossians 3, this should be the theme of your greenhouse this school year, that everything be done with love and humility and patience and peace and music and singing and thanksgiving in your home. And that would make an amazing, amazing greenhouse.